What does it mean to live life to the fullest, train to your potential, and perform at your best?
Leave nothing on the table. That's a non-negotiable, is that I strive to be better every day. Because if I'm not on top of my game, how is anybody else going to follow me down the road?
Keep demanding more of yourself to live up to that potential and to stay hungry.
Training is progress. You know, when I look at the word training, I think of steps, baby steps to get somewhere that you want to be. And that is basically your life journey.
It's a mindset in itself, man. It's like, it's not just about, I know that for you, a lot of that's about the physical, but we're constantly in training, whether it's growing our skill sets, whether it's growing our physical bodies, whether it's growing our relationships, whatever. And all of that's a training ground. And that kind of goes back to the mindset that we just talked about.
You underestimate yourself and you don't even start. But then once you start, you often surpass what you thought you could do.
Perform at your best, mate. That's sort of what life is all about. You know, want to have the knowledge, want to have the fitness, the health, the ambition and drive that no matter what comes along, when that next phone call comes, I can just say yes. I don't have to worry. Just go and do it.
Hey guys, welcome to the Live Train Perform podcast. I'm your host, Sean Kober, and joining me again is my friend Kat Yiannakis of Macros Muscles Mindset. Kat is one of my friends, a coach. She's interned for me at Tiger Muay Thai. She is a wealth of knowledge. We've got her back on today for the next part of our Binge Eating Disorder series. Kat, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, thank you for having me back on. I'm excited to get rocking and rolling on today's episode.
Really excited. For new listeners, can you give them a quick overview of our last episode?
So basically in our last episode, we touched on the differences between eating disorders, disordered eating habits, and binge eating disorder. So today what I'm going to do is I'll give a little bit of a recap for those of you that are kind of just joining into the episodes. And I'm also going to touch on body dysmorphic disorder today as well, because 50% of people that experience binge eating disorder also have this as a comorbidity. The main things that I want to kind of focus on today there's two things. The first one is basically touching on how the stigmas behind eating disorders create a lack of awareness and understanding within society, which contributes to poor support and outreach and help. And then the second thing that we're going to dive into, and I know that a lot of people are kind of looking forward to this, is the understanding of the psychoeducational components of binge eating disorder. So essentially the education of why binge eating disorder exists, which is one of the things we believe is left out of traditional therapies and is a core component of Macros Muscles and Mindset.
Okay. So where are we going to start today's episode?
So for those of you that are just listening in, the differences between eating disorders and disordered eating habits are this. So an eating disorder or disorders is a group of mental health conditions associated with psychological distress and significant health complications. They're complex and they involve a combination of biological, psychosocial, and social-cultural factors. They're long-term. There are serious complications which range from financial, social, medical, and mental standpoints. When we look at disordered eating habits, we're referring to eating habits that include things like yo-yo dieting, restrictive dieting, compulsive dieting, skipping meals, obsession with body types, and constant thought processes such as starting again on Monday. So symptoms reflect eating disorders, but not all symptoms are prevalent. Eventually, for a lot of people, unfortunately, they do become eating disorders. So it's why, we are focusing on this as well.
Mm-hmm.
Binge eating disorder. So if you want to find out more, obviously this is what we discussed in depth in the last episode. As a reminder, 47% of all eating disorders globally are binge eating disorder, and 50% of people with binge eating disorder have a comorbid disorder, which is commonly either depression or body dysmorphic disorder. Now, binge eating disorder is characterized by regular episodes of binge eating without compensatory behaviors. So essentially, there's no purging, there's no over-exercising or anything like that, but it's always accompanied with feelings of loss of control, guilt, or shame. Mm-hmm. Binge eating, I'll just quickly run through it so people get a understanding, but binge eating is also always within a short time frame, and it can range from mild to extreme, so that being one episode a week up to 14 or more. and can fluctuate over time. So you might have binge eating disorder for 8 years, but you might have it for a period where it's mild, and then there might be periods where it's really extreme.
Mm-hmm. Just in the last episode as well, we did touch on the psychological, emotional, social, financial. So if anyone wants to know more about that, head back to that episode, which I'll have linked in the show notes. We also discussed how to identify these issues, as well as provided some resources to help identify and address them. So today we're going to be going through some more treatment options. Is that the flow of today's session?
Yeah, so today I'm going to kind of go through a few more of those, daily examples that people with body dysmorphic disorder and binge eating disorder go through, so people get a little bit more of an awareness of how it really affects lives. And then I will go into, that understanding, that psychoeducational component of why binge eating disorder exists. So I guess the starting point is to also explain what body dysmorphic disorder is, because the two quite often come hand in hand. So body dysmorphic disorder is where someone is extremely worried or preoccupied about a perceived flaw or imperfection in their appearance. Now, it might include one or more facial features or body parts, and it may be minor, like, most of the time no one knows what it is, but the person experiencing it is constantly thinking about it, and it consumes them to the point where there's anxiety, there's embarrassment, to the point where they avoid social situations and public settings. So it can really lead to harmful behaviours, basically in an effort to fix, change, or hide appearance. And like you said, in our last episode, we kind of touched on the effects of binge eating disorder and that it's had, particularly on a personal level, but I've had some clients request that I put forward some more examples so people gain that further understanding of how it really affects people day to day.
Are you happy to roll straight into those examples?
Yep, absolutely. So, for example, I'll start with financial. This is one that I think people aren't aware of. I know, like last episode, I touched on, in a personal level where I went through an extreme binge eating period. It affected, my income because I wasn't able to go to work because I had such big binge episodes that, I was in pain, I couldn't leave my bed, I was crying, I was upset. But for some of my clients, I've had some people come to me and admit spending over $100 per binge. Now, if you're on a severe scale, that's 4 or 5 binges a week. That's up to $400 or $500 on food. So when you're looking at binge eating disorder, some people will seek food to the point where it's literally getting in the car, driving to places to get food, ordering in excessively, going food shopping and then eating a large majority of it and then having to go and buy more food. So it becomes really expensive. And, it's gotten to the point for some people where, they've reached out to me and it's like, hey, I can't even pay my utility bills because my binge eating racked up $800 this week. And it's affecting people on that scale where it's like, I can't go to an event or a concert this weekend because my binge eating cost me $200 and that was my ticket to a concert.
Wow.
So, yeah, there's these things about binge eating disorder that a lot of people don't think about on a broader scale, and the financial aspect is one of them. And, it also leads into that medical financial side of things too, because when we look at binge eating disorder, if you don't get to intervening early, there's this expenditure on things long term. Now, when I'm talking long term, and I know I mentioned this in the last podcast, but for a lot of people with binge eating disorder, it can have a very large effect on the kidneys because you're putting your body through so much pressure and constant changes in blood pressure from what you're eating. A lot of people develop Addison's disease, high blood pressure, diabetes, arthritis, and sleep apnea. And then there's this additional constant output later on in life if there hasn't been an intervention early on. So there's almost like this constant financial output when you're looking at binge eating disorder.
Can we just pause there for a second?
Because
I want to ask, you mentioned before about, these kind of cycles that people go through. So I've got to imagine that there's some sort of physiological response to this as well. People have a binge, they have an episode, and then they don't have any compensatory activities or patterns or anything that's like burning off that excess energy that's coming in. Then they feel guilty about it. and then they're typically going to reach for food or some other form of comfort that's going to make them feel better, and then it ends up becoming this like self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Is there something to that?
Yeah, there is, and that is definitely something we'll talk about in the next bit, part of the psychoeducational
I'm skipping ahead, sorry.
That's okay. No, that's totally fine.
I'm just thinking like in terms of like the autonomic nervous system, right, and managing the sympathetic and the parasympathetic states. And if you're stressing out because you've had an episode and you feel guilty about it, and then, you know, it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy, then that's adding stress and anxiety and, you know, can lead to depression and things like that.
Yep, you're spot on. So yeah, we'll definitely roll into that after I just go through the social cultural aspect. But as we mentioned in that last episode as well, when people go through these binging processes, your body responds in such a way that it's like everything's thrown out. Like it becomes difficult to breathe. It's harder to sleep. You wake up in the middle of the night thirsty. You're dehydrated. Your eyes are puffy the next day. There's, you know, that series of things that has affected the nervous system, and that's, you know, your body responds straight away, and thereafter, you know, 24 hours later, you still feel it, like you've got sugar fog. Yeah, and obviously when you elicit that stress response, then that's going to also create an inflammatory response, and if you're eating certain foods, most of these things that we're binging on are typically going to be higher processed foods, right? So then that's going to, you know, elevate blood sugar levels, cause blood sugar dysregulation, which then has this like massive cascading effect throughout the body. Yep. Yeah. And it's exactly why the kidneys struggle. Gotcha. You know, the research that's coming out at the moment, this is what's being studied a lot in the past couple of years, is, you know, 10 to 15 years later, post-recovery, what people are going through in terms of kidney failure and Addison's disease. Because they're becoming more and more common, and that link is becoming more and more obvious. Yep. Can you explain Addison's disease? Addison's disease is essentially when your body is unable to produce the right amount of aldosterone because of frequent fluctuations from cortisol levels. So if you have had a binge, for example, and it's something that you've gone through for prolonged periods of time or for years, your cortisol levels or your stress hormone is constantly pumping out into the body, and to try and regulate that, your aldosterone levels are trying to compensate, and what happens over time is that they basically the aldosterone no longer produces because it's like, I don't really know what to do, so it almost fails. Basically, Addison's disease is like your aldosterone is failing. Gotcha. So it becomes to the point where if you can't manage it lifestyle, it's a constant steroid injection that you need. Yeah, that's pretty crazy. And just for the listeners as well, like your hormones, they're chemical messengers which speak to different cells in the body and you know, elicit different physiological responses depending on what the body requires at that time. And again, that stress adds into that. That's going to change your hormone profile, which then changes your physiological responses, which then it can change your mindset, it can change your thoughts, your emotions, and then those thoughts and emotions can then have an impact on, you know, neurotransmitters, hormones, etc., etc. So yeah, everything's tied in together. Now, just in saying that, I'm assuming that can also lead to things like diabetes and things like that when you have this constant fluctuation of blood sugar levels, and then your body's secreting insulin, etc., and then that becomes desensitized and then can lead to other things like, you know, diabetes and other health implications. Is that correct? Yep. And this is exactly what the research is currently looking at. You know, binge eating disorder was only classified in 2013, which just blows my mind. Really? 2013 is when it was officially created as its own entity. So the research now, when we're looking at like 2019, 2020, the stuff that's coming out is like, okay, what are the long-term effects from what's happened, you know, 10, 15 years prior. So, as I said, the major things have been the Addison's disease and looking at adolescents who are now into their mid-20s who are experiencing pre-diabetes and diabetes. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of comes out of these studies in the next couple of years. Gotcha. Yeah, sorry, we went off on a little bit of a tangent there. I just wanted to bring up a couple of those points because my brain was just ticking. And again, that's how, it affects people on a daily basis. Like, to the point where it's like you're waking up in the middle of the night dehydrated. It affects how you perform and speak to your friends the next day. It all links in. So I guess one of the things that my clients has mentioned to me, it's like, and we all kind of say it when we have our roundtables and our workshops, it's like the biggest thing that binge eating disorder affects is our social lives. And for those of you guys that have listened to our previous podcasts, I've experienced 6 eating disorders in my time. I've recovered from all 6, and I'm still going through and working through body dysmorphic disorder. But when I look at all 6 of them, binge eating disorder is, for me, by far the worst. Like, it affected me on so many different levels, and the biggest one for me as well was socially. So binge eating disorder can cause people to feel really anxious around food, going to events, going out for dinner. And, I've had clients that have avoided going out for dinner for months at a time because the nature of their disorder. People will choose to avoid or isolate themselves just to not be around food because they're scared of losing control or being at a grazing table where it's like, I know I'm not going to be able to stop myself. You've got this one component there, and then you've also got this other component where, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but people become anxious about the event and then binge eat prior. So then they're not able to enjoy or attend the event because of the binge. And this is really, really common. And I've had clients struggle with this, like not being able to go to weddings and concerts and dinner events and out on dates because they've become so anxious in the day that they've binged and then they can't make it to the event because they feel sick. And now, when you've also got body dysmorphic disorder as a comorbidity, it's hard to attend events anyway because you've also got this perception of yourself. And it's like, if you think there's a perceived flaw, it's like, I don't really want to go. I want to wear something different. I want to hide. So you've got this combination of 2 things. It's like, I'm either going to overeat or I don't want people to see me. So it gets really, really difficult for people to put themselves in social situations or new situations. And, when someone has a binge and then they have to bail out, people are like, oh, this person's a flake. And it's like, well, they're not really a flake. It's the fact that they're in a position where they can't move because they've just created this distress and they've gotten themselves into a binge cycle. So
let's pause there for a second as well, because that can be like really powerful as well. If other people are thinking those thoughts about you, or you're perceiving that they're thinking those thoughts about you, even just the perception of that, then that's going to, that could potentially be a trigger for that downward spiral, right? That could trigger an episode, just simply perceiving that other people are going to be thinking that, and you don't show up and people think that you're a flake or whatever. Yep.
And this is where, when people say binge eating, eating disorders are complex, this is where it gets complex. There's a lot of things going on. And like, on a personal example, when I look at my binge eating disorder when it was really extreme, my body dysmorphic disorder was really extreme as well. So there's a period of my life where it's about 3 years, basically the entire time I lived in Sydney, where there's no photos of me. I basically never went to Sydney. If you look at photos.
And you wore moo-moos to the gym.
And I wore moo-moos to the gym. I couldn't handle being in photos because I perceived myself one way because my binges were so bad. So I felt puffy. I felt sick. I was like, I don't want people to see me. I'm hiding. And, while I control my binge, my body dysmorphic disorder now, there's still periods of time where I might take a selfie or 2 and then I look at it and I'm like, absolutely not. I'm not taking any more photos today. Like, I just am not.
So that one thing can then impact the rest of your day.
Exactly. Absolutely. And we'll talk about this soon, but that's also, one of the reasons I'm personally off, social media as well. So there's a lot of different things that happen when you've got the two things swinging and swaying. I have clients, and I can empathize with this too, who have chosen not to date people for periods of time because either their binge eating disorder controls their ability to enjoy the date, or their body dysmorphic disorder controls their ability to feel worthy of meeting new people and going out and about. Like, there's this perceived perception. It's like, I don't want to meet new people. I feel crap. I've just had a binge. Like, I don't want people to see me. And again, it becomes that cycle of like, perception, and it can just spiral in and out.
Yeah, that psychological component is so massive, and that's something that we talk about as coaches all the time. When I'm sure you're the same. When I first started training people, started coaching people, like it was all about the training program, nutrition plan. But then, very soon realized that, we had to address the psychological and behavioral components. Now, the reason I bring that up is because I did hear about some recent research where they looked at people that were perceived to be carrying secrets that showed up as like a physical burden. So, for example, people estimated that the hills that they were looking at were far steeper than what they actually were, or the distances that they needed to cover were far further than people that perceived those burdens differently, right? So think about the words that we use when we're looking at secrets and burdens and things like that. It's weighing me down. I'm carrying the weight of the world on my shoulders, etc., etc. So, I'm sure we're going to touch on this, but, the NLP practitioner in my mind is like, how we talk to ourselves, how we associate with these different things is going to ultimately determine what our responses are going to be. Is that correct? Or what's your line of thinking on that?
Correct. And I've got one more thing to touch on about in the social aspect of things, but language is one of the components we talk about in our psychoeducational components, and
which is coming up, right?
One. It's coming up.
Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead again.
No, it's okay. It's okay. This is more just that social effect that these disorders have for people, particularly for women. It becomes really complex, and it's hard to explain to people when it's like. I want to make sure I articulate this properly because some of my clients have really wanted me to hone in on this. But, for example, I received a card on my 30th birthday, right? And it was this moment of like, holy crap, not even my family know how much my eating disorders have taken away from my life, right? And a lot of women get this and they experience this. And this card read, my mum's going to kill me, that it said, "Dear Catherine, happy 30th. I can't wait to see you as a wife," right? Now, firstly, let's just put aside the fact that I'm a happy, strong, powerful woman running 2 successful businesses. I've recovered from 6 eating disorders. I've traveled 50 countries, and my value doesn't depend on my marital status. But let's look at how even my close family are unable to recognize how much my eating disorders affected me in my 20s, right? So while most girls in their 20s were out dating and thinking about weddings and talking about kids and stuff, I've never thought about those things because I spent my 20s waking up thinking, will I make it through today? And then eventually getting to that recovery stage of being like, how can I make it through today? And while I've lived a very fun and fulfilling life, my 20s were still gripped by the illnesses themselves or the recovery process. So a lot of the women that are working with me and are single or in their 30s, I can empathize with them because it's like a lot of us haven't started dating until we're like 26, 27 because we couldn't go to work some days. The last thing we're thinking about is finding a husband, grandmother. Like, you know what I mean? We have to have spent the time recovering and going through these processes to be where we're at today and, get to that point where it's like, okay, who will I help make it through today? And, obviously for me, I'm at that point where I'm recovered and I'm able to help others and give others, tools and techniques and therapy and, happy and whole. But there are a lot of people who experience eating disorders that miss out on large parts of life because of it. And when we talk about that, a lot of women, they enter their 30s and if they're, they're single or they've just gotten into a relationship, people ask the question of like, do you want kids? And a lot of women don't answer it the way they want to because of the lack of awareness around body dysmorphic disorder. Now, for me, I absolutely not. I just say it, absolutely not, because of where I'm at in my life, right? And body dysmorphic disorder means that you're hyper aware of your body. And that bodily transformation that you go through pregnancy, for a lot of us, that's just anxiety thinking about it, right?
Can I pause there for a second? Because you said you're hyper aware of your body. Now, is that like real awareness or is it perceived awareness? Because if
it's perceived.
Because that's the reason why I wanted to stop there for a second, because like I can say that I'm hyper aware of my body, okay, but what I mean by that is not like I'm picking it apart. I mean like I can tell when my stress levels are a little bit high or my accumulated stress load over a couple of days is a little bit high, and I know that I need to maybe take a little bit easier with training today, and I need to do some more mindfulness based work, or maybe I can feel my body's like maybe a little bit depleted in certain nutrients, so I'm going to be looking for certain foods to balance that out, etc., etc. So I just wanted to pause there for a second and highlight that point.
Yeah. So let me just kind of finish this, because this is something my clients really wanted me to say. Okay. So, as I said, I will say absolutely not right now, because I'm aware that my body dysmorphic disorder isn't gone. And while I don't have a partner, it matters maybe a bit less. But for those that do, there needs to be that awareness that for people on the other side of the relationship, because some females don't want to put themselves through that huge bodily change while their disorder affects their image so strongly as it is, it's hard to discuss that with people. So, I've started living a very successful life, and it's liking what I do, how I do it, liking myself as I do it. And if my body dysmorphic disorder goes away in 6 weeks or 6 months or, another year, then obviously the answer is going to change. But there's an awareness that society needs to understand for women who experience body dysmorphic disorder, and that is that a lot of people won't go through that process of pregnancy until they're ready, because we don't want to worsen the condition. Now, unfortunately, this leaves some females not willing to date long term or not willing to date at all, as they believe that, or they feel that their partners are scared about not being able to have a family. And that's not the case, because body dysmorphic disorder can be treated, and a partner should be there to help make that happen. So again, there's this lack of awareness that can create complications on social and relationship fronts. And then that's what brings us into understanding eating disorders on a psychoeducational level. And, what we teach at Macros Muscles Mindset is not just for clients, but it's in their support system too. So it's being able to create this awareness for partners as well, where it's like, okay, right now this person isn't ready to, go through the process of pregnancy, because mentally that perceived perception of themselves is too scary. It's causing too much anxiety, and this person's going to need another year or two before we can move into that stage. And it's really difficult conversations to have with people, particularly if you're just starting dating. So
they are the important conversations, though.
Yeah, and this is why my clients are like, Kat, please mention this tonight, because people ask me this question if I want kids, and it's like, yeah, but I can't right now because of how I feel about myself. So I really just wanted to pop that out there before I move into the next component of stuff.
Yeah, cool. Just before we get into the next component, again, I'm probably skipping ahead, so apologies if I am. But what I want to ask is, how much do your habits play into these conditions?
Okay, we're going to go straight into it. We're going to go straight into it now.
Good segue.
Good segue. So, look, with therapy for binge eating disorder, and just so people know, I'm specialised only for binge eating disorder, but the body dysmorphic disorder stuff, a lot of what I talk about is just personal experience and, how I've managed to help with some of these tools and techniques for clients too. But essentially what you're trying to achieve is abstinence from binge eating, modifications of dysfunctional thoughts and behaviours, increase insight into how to deal with conflicts and negative emotions, and obviously relapse prevention. Now, traditional therapies for binge eating disorder are psychotherapies like CBT, DBT, and interpersonal therapy. Pharmacological applications for a lot of people, lifestyle modifications. Now, what I noticed over the years with these kinds of therapies was an inability to kind of connect with any of them. And the reason being that they were constantly focusing on the past, and I found it really difficult to understand why binge eating was happening. I was like, why is this happening? What's the underlying reasons, and what self-monitoring and behavioral techniques can I use to improve my actions and my thoughts? So this is what led me to researching evidence-based practices, going through NLP training, and then thoroughly understanding psychoeducational components, right? So the 5 foundational components that we talk about at Macros Muscles Mindset is, firstly, understanding how habits are formed and how binge eating disorder can become a habit. The second one is understanding the upper and lower brain, so why we get urges for binges and why we act on them. The third one is understanding the impact of language, so how it contributes to self-talk and behaviors. The fourth is the concept of neuroplasticity, and the fifth is progressive mindfulness and mindful eating. So the things that you've mentioned or you've heard me talk about and you've kind of like thrown in, all of them are make up these 5 components. So we can go through them now. But that's essentially the 5 things that we look at Macros Muscles Mindset over, it can be 6 months, 12 months, 3 years, whatever pace the person's going at.
Mm-hmm.
And then once we get through that, it's then working through the behavioral weight loss therapy things. So, focusing on stuff like understanding your macros, understanding, stress, sleep, the stuff that, we talked about in previous episodes.
Yep. So where do we go from here? Are we starting from the top of that list?
Yeah, let's do it. I tend to start actually with understanding the upper and lower brain.
Mm-hmm.
So for people that have experienced or do experience binging episodes or feel like they're in a position where it's like there's some days where I can't control what I'm eating, it's really good to understand the brain at a very, very basic level. So one of the things that we go through, when we onboard clients is basically discussing the 2 parts of the brain. Now, in the most simple terms, we can look at the brain in 2 sections. So we've got the upper brain, or the higher brain, and we've got the lower brain, which is considered primal or reptilian, depending on.
So you could say the old evolutionary brain and the new brain.
Yep.
The new smart brain.
That also works too. The new smart brain. So I tend to just say upper and lower, but that's good for people to know that there are different kind of terminologies around it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the upper brain is what we consider our true selves. So the frontal cortexes of the brain are responsible for moving us into action. They're responsible for memory, critical thinking, and impulse control. The lower brain...
That would be considered the conscious brain?
The conscious brain, yes. Now, the lower brain or the reptilian brain, as some people might read it at, is basically considered it's the primal brain. It's responsible for impulses, for muscle memory, and things like reflexes, right? So when we look at binge eating disorder...
So this could be considered the subconscious brain.
Correct, yeah. So when we're looking at binge eating disorder, there's an urge, right? There is always if you want to binge, it's because of an urge. Now, our lower brain's main function is for survival. It's constantly pleasure-seeking and avoiding pain, okay? So urges to overeat, to gamble, to drink, I guess maybe even looking at your phone, and, other self-sabotaging behaviors come from this lower brain. So it's basically always in a state to protect you. It responds to your external and internal environments and responds automatically with its own advice. Okay, so really simple, basic example is internally you're feeling super, super stressed. The lower brain responds with an urge. You act on it by drinking a glass of wine. Okay, you've responded to that urge. Now, the lower brain doesn't care at all if the reward that you're giving it or you're acting on is positive or negative. Okay, you're basically releasing endorphins because you've acted on it. So this then ties into what I want to talk about in a moment about habit loops. But the brain basically seeks and constantly seeking this pleasure. So it's like if you've worked or if you've acted on an urge and then the urge comes up again, your brain's going to be like, hey, last time we did this, I had happy endorphins. So you reach and act on the urge again, it makes it stronger. So essentially the lower brain gives the higher brain its information, which is the urge, and then the higher brain chooses what to do with it, so to act or not to act. Now what this means is the lower brain can't actually make you do anything. It can't make you get up and eat food or gamble or smoke.
It just sends a signal.
Eating the food, it's sending the signal. The lower brain is demanding things, right? It's a little bitch. It's like, I want this, I want this. Your true self, your higher brain is making the ultimate decision. And that awareness for a lot of people when they have binge eating disorder is like, oh, it's not actually me, it's my brain, right? So what we're trying to teach at Macros Muscles Mindset is like, okay, well, what tools and techniques can we use to tell the little bitch to shut up, right? And, you know, each person has their own way of approaching it, talking to it. I call it the little bitch. I call it the little bitch.
Clearly.
That's just what I do.
Cat's
Some
little
people
bitch.
call it. I have a client who calls her Susan.
She got bullied by Susan in high school, didn't she?
So understanding the upper and lower brain is a really, really important concept of binge eating disorder. And when you go through traditional therapies, it's not actually touched on. So that's why we try to be like, okay, understand this first and understand that it's not actually you, and try and gain an understanding of the difference between your brain, because even that single awareness can mean when you're in the kitchen next and you're feeling like you've got an urge or a binge, you can just be like, it's the little bitch. You know, there's this awareness that comes into play, and then that's, once we've kind of got that, we can then move into the next component, which is the habit loops.
Can we just pause there for a second again? You spoke about like the lower brain sending that signal, and then the upper brain deciding whether or not it actions that signal. Now, this is probably something you've already planned on touching on, but my question is, are there things that we can do to dampen that signal so that we don't have to make that conscious decision?
There is. This ideally will probably be in the next podcast.
Yep.
Because dampening the voice, or, you know, whatever you decide to call your lower brain,
Susan.
There's actually different tools and techniques. If you want to dampen Susan out,
Susan.
there's different techniques, and, you know, the environment that you're in as well, you can pull different techniques from. So, for example, like last year when a lot of us were in lockdown and that primal brain was screaming, people had to use different tools, right? Very different tools to what they're using now. Like, I had one client who, to try and control her urges, would use an urge jar, and every time she had an urge, she would throw a corn kernel into her urge jar to just basically bring awareness to be like, well, my urges are full on right now. Like, you know, so there's different ways that you can dampen it, and we'll definitely touch on that next episode. But
cool.
yeah, super important question.
Continue. Sorry, I keep jumping in and like asking these questions.
No, it's good because these are the questions that I've had people, you know, ask as well after last episode. So, the next thing is understanding habit loops, and I know obviously you've gone through a fair few episodes on this in your own podcast.
Yep, which I'll actually have those linked in the show notes as well, so people that are listening can go back and listen to those episodes and get a little bit more understanding of, you know, the context of how to build habits, why habits are so important, how to use progressive overload to get these habits to either move you in the right direction or stop you from sabotaging yourself and moving in the wrong direction.
Yep. So I'll keep this one a little bit, you know, more brief and just kind of explain it particularly to binge eating. So basically, to understand binge eating disorder, you do need to understand the concept of the habit genome, and it's based on a neurological loop. So it's made up of 3 parts. You've got a cue, a routine, and a reward. Now, this loop begins as a creation of a behavior, a method of protection, a reward system for our psychological or emotional physical being, right? The behavior can make us feel empowered, comforted, you know, whatever it is for a short time. And again, it's that potential urge or calling from the lower brain and then your higher brain acting on it. Now, as I mentioned, whether or not it's a positive or negative reward, the doing of the action releases endorphins into the brain and creates happy feelings. So even if it's a negative behavior like binging, gambling, etc., the adverse effects of these highs aren't what the brain addicts itself to, you know? The brain is striving for those endorphins, so it's saying more, and
the brain's not thinking about the long-term implications. It's thinking about the short-term implications. If I do this, I'm rewarding myself, so I'm going to give myself a little reward for that.
Correct. Totally correct. And what this does, and this then leads into the next thing, which is the language, you basically create a neurological pathway, okay? So you're creating something from A to B, right? So say, for example, you've broken up with your partner, you feel like shit, you have a day where you sit at home and you eat a tub of ice cream. You've made yourself feel a little bit better for a short period of time because ice cream is delicious. Now, what happens is you've there created a path A to B. And what can happen with binge eating is if you've created that path from one emotion, what might happen later on is in the week is you might feel another emotion, right? You might feel stressed out about something. Your brain remembers how you felt last time. So it's like, okay, well, last time I felt sad and I ate and then I felt better. This time I feel stressed. Maybe if I eat, I'll feel better again.
It creates an association. There's a link.
It creates an association.
Yep.
Bam. So with binge eating disorder, what happens is the links become more and more frequent with different emotional feelings or cues. And the cues can be anything. They can be physiological, so like from time. They can be a place. They can be an event. So, for example, a wedding might set someone off, and then they might have a concert, and that same feeling of anxiety being around people will then create that feeling or need or that urge to eat again. So the links become stronger and more frequent with different feelings. And that's what essentially binge eating disorder becomes, because it's like the more, or I should say when it becomes extreme, the more feelings that you're having, the more of those neurological pathways are created. And what happens is those pathways, the stronger they become or the more you repeat it, it becomes a habit. So it becomes even harder to break.
It's the path of least resistance.
Correct.
So I've heard you talk about like trampling grass. Is that right? Trampling grass as creating those pathways. Speak on that.
Yeah. Speak. So basically, when I talk to clients about this, I'm like, let's look at it visually, right? So let's use the example again of breaking up with someone. You are at point A. Let's say you've got a big grassy field in front of you. You feel like crap, but you eat some ice cream. You walk across the path of the grass, you stamp it down, and then you feel a little bit better because you've eaten your ice cream. Now, what happens is if you feel crappy later in the week, you do that again, your brain has said, hey, remember last time we walked across that grass, point A to B? Let's do it again. And what happens is that grass gets stamped down deeper and deeper and deeper until it becomes a pathway, right? And then there's this association, as you said, from point A to point B.
Like, I feel like this now, and those emotions might be a little bit different, but they're connected. And it's like, last time I did this, I ended up over there. I felt better. I'm going to take that path again.
Exactly. Now, our goal when we're looking at binge eating disorder therapy is, okay, well, how do we now get rid of that path and create a new one? So let's get rid of A to B and create A to C. Okay, so we then have to find tools and techniques to try and unravel the habit loops that have been created. And that's where things get, again, complicated, because you're not only just looking at the habit loop itself of the behavior, such as, eating. A lot of people are also experiencing language issues, self-talk. They're talking themselves into things, which is actually in itself a habit loop. You can say to yourself, oh, you know what? I'll just eat this ice cream now and I'll start again tomorrow. Guess what? That's a habit loop. Yep. And you've just stuck it on top of another one. So it's like we have to unravel things slowly and over time. And that's why I tell people, I'm like, when you're looking at binge eating disorder, this isn't going to go away in 3 months, because there are so many habits that we have to unravel.
This is why it's so complex.
And interrupt. Yeah.
Because you might, I'm sure we're going to talk about habit stacking, but to get to that point where that has become a habit is like you get that signal, you go through that routine, you get the reward. And then, you could be stacking negative habits on top of that. As you said, you're justifying that with how you speak to yourself. You're justifying that with how you feel directly afterwards. So, those habits are going to build in either a positive manner or a negative manner. And the more you let those negative habits build and stack one upon the other, the longer it's going to take to be able to unravel that.
Yep, exactly. And, people ask, they're like, oh, your clients have been with you for so long. And I'm like, yeah, guess what? I had eating disorders for 15 years. Like, they don't just go. They're complicated. You need to work on them. It's like a job. It's honestly like a job. You're trying to unravel behaviors and habits that you've had with you for a very, very long time. And this then leads into the third component, which is why language matters, like how we talk to ourselves, what we say, what we read, when we read it, and what we see. So, most of our beliefs are formed by words. Our beliefs can be changed by words as well. So an effective selection of words used in our daily lives can either heighten or empower our emotional responses, reactions, and behaviors, or, on the other hand, poor word selection can have the same impact on our responses and behaviors, but negatively. So the power of the words that we use out loud to ourselves, how we communicate with our friends, and what we read all affect our life experiences and how we behave. So we can instantly change our feelings and reactions by changing the words that we use associated with particular emotional experience, with how we interact with people, with what we say in our vocabulary around certain things. And for example, with Macros Muscles Mindset, one of the biggest things that we look at is the language that we use around food, and how we label food. This is a big one. Like, if you label foods good and bad, you may find that you either crave or lack self-control around these, inverted commas, bad foods. And with this, then comes the behaviors of thinking like, okay, I'll give in today, or I've deserved this, or I'll start on Monday. And then it creates that action of overeating, binging, feeling guilty, trying to, again, inverted commas, clean eat. How if you use your words to break your own habitual emotional patterns, then your actions will change. So with us at Macros Muscles Mindset, one of the biggest things we do is say, hey, we look at food as wholesome and less wholesome, or nutrient dense and less nutrient dense. We don't use good or bad, because that basically is giving a black and white label to food, and that's the last thing that we want. We don't want to create restriction, we want to create balance. So it's changing those old habits and the current vocabulary to basically challenge your mind and make you start to think about food in a different way.
That's interesting. As a coach, we always talk about food as sustenance. Like, this is our energy. We want to be putting good fuel into our body. You don't have a Ferrari and put in fucking Gasohol 91. Put the best fuel that you can into that car so it runs smoothly, and our bodies are the same. Now, there's going to be times where we allow ourselves to, put in some less than optimal fuel, but understanding that the majority of the time we want to be putting good quality fuels in that are going to be serving us.
Yeah, and even just there, you've used words that don't label something black and white. You've said less optimal and optimal.
I did that intentionally.
Okay, so intentionally.
Yep.
But, that's how I know that's how you speak to your clients, right? Because you practice NLP too. So, these things language affects us in so many ways, and we'll talk about this in the next episode for sure, particularly around social media, but it goes back to how we learn things at school, like the nutritional pyramid, and I know in Australia it's different to the US, but, at school it was good and bad, and, in grade 7 we had this weird thing where we counted calories at the age of 12 and tried to work out good foods and bad foods, and... Really? This affects you long term. Yeah, that's another story.
Fuck, man, I was like learning how to use a computer. How do I turn this thing on?
Yeah, so it goes back to so many things, and visually as well. What you see on social media and what you see in the news, what you see in your magazines, when you see it, all of these things affect how you think about food and how you interact with food and what you choose to do with food. And when again, you have that urge...
That association.
Exactly. So when you have that urge in the back of your head, and then it's like, oh, the magazine said I can eat this cake and then I'll start this diet that's in the magazine tomorrow. Well,
hang on a second. I'm like, why are you reading that magazine? Like, that's literally just there to try and sell product.
Yeah. So, these are the things that affect us on a daily basis. And these are, and we'll go into this in the next episode, but again, language is one of the things that is key to unraveling binge eating disorder. The replacement of words from have to get to, like, I get to eat. vegetables every day is much better than saying I have to eat my vegetables. There's a massive difference with how, we speak about food. So that is point 3. We've got 2 more to quickly touch on. The 4th one being neuroplasticity, which is something I know, again, you've touched on in an earlier episode of yours. Essentially, this links into habit loops, but it is the fact that the brain is constantly able to change. So neurons that fire together wire together. So it's the process of forming and strengthening and solidifying neural pathways. So basically what I'm saying is the brain can change. And when we're looking at binge eating disorder in particular, it's something that can be recovered from. Mm-hmm. And understanding that the brain, it's a sophisticated system. It's there for survival and homeostasis. We have that ability to create new neural pathways, and that's one of the focuses of understanding the brain, understanding habit loops, understanding neuroplasticity, because that's what will lead us into different behaviors and habit change.
Yep. Just to add on to that as well, and kind of ties into your grass trampling that you spoke about earlier, about that those neural pathways. Like, the more you do something, the more it becomes habit, the more those neural pathways get reinforced. And you take like a country dirt track and then a road, and then the more you do it, it becomes like a fucking 4 or 5 lane highway, right? So how we need to re-establish different neural pathways, we need to start breaking that highway down, right? We start fucking bombing it, we start picking it apart, and then that goes from a 4-lane highway to a 3-lane highway, and then we break that down again, then we break that down again, we break that down again, and then we start creating new pathways. And I'm sure that's something we'll touch on. Are we going through that today or in the next episode?
No, we'll go through that in the next episode. And then in the next one as well, our 5th component is progressive mindfulness and mindful eating. And a lot of that is actually tools and techniques. So we can touch on that a little bit more tomorrow. But it's essentially, and I know you've actually talked about this in an episode as well, but it's essentially finding some tools and techniques that almost lead you into the next step of behavioral weight loss therapy, and just understanding how to become a little bit more aware of your surroundings with food and the environment that the food is in. If you're at a restaurant, slowing down, how to slow down, putting your knife and fork down, chewing your food correctly, and just becoming more aware. But again, that is one of the stages that moves into tools and techniques, so we can touch on that in the next episode.
Gotcha. Cool. Is there anything else that we need to touch on today? We've gone through all of those components.
We've gone through the major components of, the psychoeducational components of binge eating disorder. I hope it has made sense to people. It's really important to understand why and how binge eating disorder happens, because some of the traditional therapies, unfortunately, don't always touch base on it, and it can become quite overwhelming. Yeah,
that's a great point. A lot of people become their diagnosis. And it's like, right, this is, I've been diagnosed with this is who I am, I can't change that. And I was like, no, well, you can change that. So, I think understanding the upper lower brain and those signals, and separating the signal from the noise, right? Understanding what your body's going through and why it's going through that, because education breeds compliance. If you know why you're doing something, you're typically going to be able to follow through on that. Okay, but if you don't know why you're doing something, you can't really change it. That's the first part of creating change, is being aware.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, this is awesome. I'm really, really, really happy that you've had me on and be able to talk about this in a open space.
Yeah, awesome. And in our last episode, we spoke about this. I asked you about some resources that we could, or that I could link, or that I could read up on myself before we had our conversation, so I could do my homework. And you're like, well, this is the problem. There's not many good resources out there. So that's one of the reasons why we decided to get on here and do this series, so that we can put out some good quality information to people that are potentially going through their own journey of, eating disorders, and identifying those things and addressing them before it gets so bad that, it does become a habit and things are out of control.
Yeah. No, I'm really, really happy to be on. Thank you so much.
Yeah, awesome. My pleasure. All right, Kat, I'll have all of your links in the show notes. All of the episodes that we spoke about today and some of those resources will be linked there as well. But let's do this again in the next episode. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can start addressing these issues and put some quality processes in place to allow everyone to be better at life. Awesome.
Thanks, dude.
Thanks, mate. I'll see you soon. And there we have it. Great conversation with my friend Kat Yiannakis of Macros, Muscles, Mindset. This was part 2 of a 3-part series. In the next episode, we're going to be diving a little bit deeper into some of the treatment protocols that Kat's used with herself and with her clients. All of the podcast episodes that we touched on and the topics that we discuss in this episode will be linked in the show notes. Some of those episodes will include the power of habit, creating consistency, restricting temptation, mindfulness, and discipline. This episode was brought to you by Swiss 8, which is a proactive mental health program designed to allow you to structure in and schedule 8 pillars of health and wellness via an app on your phone to allow you to be better at life. Any 5-star ratings and reviews are much appreciated, guys. Much love. Peace.